So, so firstly, welcome to everybody to today's IFIAD event. My name is Professor Charlie Spillane. I'm from NUI Galway. I'm the current chair of the Irish Forum for International Agricultural Development. Just for any of you that don't know what IFIAD is, we've got a multidisciplinary, sectoral and multi-actor kind of platform in Ireland where we've tried to bring together all of the various entities and institutions in Ireland to combine their expertise and skills in pursuit of agriculture for international development. And so delighted that everybody could make it here today. It's great to see you all, many familiar faces, some people I don't know. As Patrice indicated, we've about 60 people registered, and we have people registered from the Irish development organisations, but also from the Irish Embassy Network, which is wonderful. We're very delighted as IFIAD to welcome our colleagues from Department of Foreign Affairs and also from the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, where today's topic is going to be discussing IFAD's upcoming work programme and also Ireland's partnership with IFAD. Very much also, I have to point out, very delighted that Tom Arnold can be with us today. Tom has recently been announced as Ireland's Special Envoy on Food Systems, so that's really great news for Ireland, and so wonderful to have Tom with us. So just before as a kind of prelude, I suppose, I'll just say a few words about IFAD. The International Fund for Agricultural Development has a long history. It was founded in 1977. It's a specialized agency of the United Nations, works to address poverty and hunger in rural areas in developing countries. And it's dispersed about $50 billion US dollars since its foundation to finance agriculture and rural development. One of the key I suppose, ways of working of IFAD is its people-centered approach, looking at growth from below, investments at community level in small and medium enterprises, small-scale producers, and rural non-farm economy. So a very comprehensive and kind of systemic approach. It's clear that the IFAD work program is going to have a major role to play in reaching the 2030 agenda, particularly SDG 1 and also SDG 2. This is for IFIAD. This is not the first time that we've had some interactions with IFAD. We've had the president of IFAD here in 2019 as the keynote speaker for our annual conference, and that was a really wonderful event. And today's event really comes at a very opportune time when Ireland is resuming its seat on the executive board of IFAD. That's going to be happening from April this year. And last month, Ireland increased its core contributions to IFAD to 12.5 million euros. It's about a 67% increase over previous core contributions. So, we're very much looking forward to hearing about the areas that IFAD will be focusing on, such as global climate finance for smallholders, targeting the poorest countries, and advancing a leaving no one behind agenda. So that's IFAD. For those of anybody on the call who's not familiar what IFAD is, that's kind of an overview of that. So just some kind of housekeeping. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end. We've 1 hour, and we'll get through this hour pretty quick. Participants can enter their questions in the Zoom chat during the Q&A session, and myself and Patrice will relay those to the relevant speaker. So at that, I'm just going to give you an overview of our speakers and welcome our speakers. So our first speaker up is Michelle Winthrop. Michelle is the Policy Director of the Development Cooperation and Africa Division of the Department of Foreign Affairs. And Michelle will be followed by Leon Williams, who's Senior Partnership Officer at the International Fund for Agricultural Development in Rome. And then we'll have closing remarks from Tom Arnold, Ireland's Special Envoy on Food Systems. And then we'll follow that with Q&A at about 14:40, and we'll close up at 3 o'clock. So we'll try to stay on time as best we can so that we can leave some time for questions from the audience, from interactivity with the speakers. So on that note, I'd like to hand over to Michelle and welcome you all again. And thanks so much for participating.
Thank you, Charlie. I hope you can all see and hear me okay. Everything all right on that front? Great. Okay, well, listen, thank you, everyone. And good to see so many familiar and friendly faces, as Leon said. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to IFIAD for hosting this event. I mean, from our perspective in the Department of Foreign Affairs, it is actually impossible to overstate the strategic importance of IFIAD as an entity and as a space for everybody working in the kind of food and agriculture space to come together and collaborate and learn. And really, it's such a fantastic resource for our work as Team Ireland more broadly. So we're extremely grateful for for the work IFIAD does, and indeed for providing us with opportunities like today. And also great to see Leon Williams from IFAD, who of course we work with very closely, and thanks to you too for joining this. So although, as Charlie mentioned, IFAD has been around a long time, IFAD is almost as old as me, which is quite terrifying. But anyway, I think you could say, that Ireland really is at the start of a new phase in our relationship with IFAD. Charlie has mentioned, we've made a commitment of 12.5 million euros to IFAD's 12th replenishment period, and that is indeed a significant increase on the last replenishment period. We're also planning this year, 2021, to provide an additional 2 million to the fund's Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture Programme, ASAP Plus it's known as. And then indeed we are preparing to take our seat on the board as an alternate member with Canada. All of this illustrates our overall confidence in IFAD's actions and ambitions. Last month, many of you will have seen Minister Brophy speak at the replenishment meeting, and he highlighted in that meeting the fact that the work of IFAD really does align with Ireland's priorities, using agriculture as the driver for eradicating hunger and poverty in rural communities. I'm going to use this opportunity to highlight some of the major priorities for the government as we embark on our role on the executive board of IFAD. Overall, there are about 6 major areas for potential collaboration. And I'm happy to hear comments and indeed questions on those. The first one relates to Ireland's commitment to reaching the furthest behind first. So when we were last on the IFAD board, we put a lot of effort into ensuring that IFAD's resources were targeted to the poorest countries, the performance-based allocation system. Now I think we need to go further. We need to reach the poorest people within those poorest countries and really ensure that we understand the nature of their vulnerability and that programs are designed accordingly. This is highlighted in A Better World as a major policy priority for Ireland. And indeed, we had a role in ensuring that the furthest behind first was embedded within the Agenda 2030 programme. IFAD's 12th replenishment plan really does reflect an ongoing commitment to leave no one behind, and really is based on a long and successful track record of IFAD in that regard. IFAD 12 talks about innovation in portfolio management, which will enable IFAD to really maximise grant-based funding to low-income countries. The addition as well, the addition of extra instruments by IFAD really does enhance this as well as the long-term commitment to financial sustainability, which of course enables IFAD to continue making grants to the poorest countries. It's worth also mentioning the adaptation programme for smallholders, the ASAP Plus programme, because that really does ensure that additional climate finance resources are explicitly targeted at the most vulnerable people. And I think that's a really important programme for us, and we've been delighted to signal a contribution to that as part of our growing prioritisation of climate resilience. The second area where I think there are opportunities for great work together is in the championing of the food systems approach, which of course is very du jour at the moment, but especially at country level. IFAD's president has set out a really ambitious programme for rural transformation, rural economies that provide a decent living, provide a scope for enterprise and a viable future. Of course, the economic impacts of COVID-19 are acute in many of our partner countries. 6 out of 9 are at high risk of debt distress at the moment. Among them, for example, is Ethiopia, also an important country for IFAD, where almost 90% of poor people live in rural areas. 2/3 of the reduction in overall poverty between 2011 and 2016 can be explained by agriculture. Growth of agriculture will remain critical given its share of employment in GDP. And poverty in Ethiopia has fallen fastest in recent years in the zones that have the strongest agricultural growth. So far, so good. But it is important to go beneath the national figures. In Ethiopia, the situation of the poorest 10% has remained stubbornly intractable, as evidenced by the persistently high numbers of people continuing to need assistance from the Productive Safety Net programme. Levels of rural extreme poverty in Ethiopia have been higher in 2016 than they were in 2005. So Ethiopia's example reinforces to us the need to consider the broad range of stakeholders within a food system, including those at risk of malnutrition, cash-poor food consumers, and farmers on marginal land who are extremely vulnerable to climate extremes. In Vietnam, there are similarly valuable lessons to be gleaned. Much of Vietnam's success in reducing poverty and increasing incomes can be attributed to export-led industrialization, including agri-food. But smallholder producers have not really shared in that success, and incomes have stayed low while environmental degradation has increased. So these are just two examples of why it's important to take an inclusive food systems approach that addresses the whole ecosystem. Taking such an approach enables us to identify and work with any trade-offs that exist between addressing food insecurity, growth in revenue from agriculture, climate resilience, and biodiversity. Crucially, it enables us to find win-win solutions to enable us to address all of these challenges in tandem. Taking a food systems approach requires clear thinking and good stakeholder management at national level. National planning processes are where these often competing objectives come together and priorities are calibrated. Based on our own experience, supporting countries to get these national processes right is a high priority for us. Here, I think IFAD also has a unique contribution to make, though, based on its tradition of working with a broad range of stakeholders, from grassroots civil society to agribusiness, academia, and governments. In my own experience, working with IFAD in the field and in HQ, it's testament to that. I have found them to be leaders in, for example, the frequently neglected theme of pastoralism, really getting to grips with how to restore dryland ecosystems and empower some of the most marginalized communities with clever use of investment. And simultaneously, I have seen IFAD show real innovation in the area of rural financial intermediation, providing access to financial services for farmers that really stimulate change. In my experience, IFAD has a really unique ability to straddle many dimensions of rural development and convene diverse stakeholders, and has done consistently over a very long period of time. I'm particularly interested in Tom's reflections on IFAD's role in national food systems processes. The third area where I see collaboration is in sharing Ireland's own experiences in the agri-food sector. At the last IFIAD conference, the then Taoiseach talked about the importance of bringing together Irish state agencies and the private sector to promote innovative partnerships. Just last week, Ministers Coveney and McConalogue launched the Ireland Africa Rural Development Committee, looking to deliver a more effective Irish contribution to sustainable food systems in Africa, and a framework for stronger agribusiness linkages between Ireland and Africa. This is, of course, in line with the Better World call for smart investment in sustainable agriculture, providing youth employment, commercialising farms, and strengthening agri-food chains. And I'm also delighted to note that IFAD has been in conversation with SFSI, indeed, on how we can really promote that sharing. Collaboration with IFAD will really help us to make that contribution as useful as possible, tailor it to the needs of partners. Ireland's transformation from hunger to global agribusiness exemplar is one which many countries want to emulate, but the onus is on us now to tease out what lessons are most useful and really understand where capacity development makes most sense. Last year, the government finalised an internal strategy for engagement with the Rome-based agencies, which forms the basis for cooperation between Department of Agriculture and Department of Foreign Affairs. Our work with IFAD is situated within that framework. Just as IFAD itself is working through a whole-of-government approach, we also see collaboration between the three agencies as significant for the achievement of the SDGs. We know this is challenging, but we do wonder if there are new opportunities to make progress and really get beyond the rhetoric. IFAD's decentralisation programme will see nearly half of all staff based in country over the next few years. That gives us a chance to look for practical steps for IFAD to collaborate and coordinate with the other agencies. For example, if expertise is scarce, can gender advisors be shared, for example? Are there other opportunities for cost savings at field level? Importantly, as we prepare for the Food Systems Summit, though, how does IFAD prepare its input in such a way as to highlight its unique characteristics, but also to demonstrate leadership of the Rome-based agencies. Clear and consistent articulation of what makes IFAD different is key here, and we as Ireland are happy to work with IFAD on that task. The next theme speaks to cross-cutting issues. I think IFAD can rightly be proud of its track record in addressing some of these themes. IFAD's portfolio of programmes reflects well the fact that women in Africa produce the vast majority of food and yet face very real challenges and barriers to growing incomes and improving diets. Rural women are also uniquely vulnerable to the effects of climate change. IFAD has shown real commitment to ensuring gender-responsive programming and putting the tools and incentives in place to challenge the status quo. Also, in recognition of the so-called youth bulge and the need for agriculture to generate jobs for young people, IFAD has been ahead of the curve in designing programs that engage young people and target them. And as mentioned above, the ASAP Plus program was also one of the examples of real innovation and ambition and scale in transforming livelihoods to being climate resilient. But going somewhat against the grain, IFAD has shown real leadership in disability inclusive programming too. So of course we will continue to encourage this sort of programming that captures rural development in all its dimensions. But there is a challenge ahead to capture the results of all this innovation in a compelling way and share the learning with other IFIs and UN agencies, as well as with partner countries themselves. Monitoring and evaluation is always an area for continuous improvement for all of us, but it's especially challenging when trying to capture changes in societal norms, women's empowerment, reaching highly marginalised groups, and indeed climate resilient outcomes. Ireland is committed to working with IFAD to demonstrate its success in addressing these issues and really tease out that learning. I suppose the last area then I'd like to highlight is the area of nutrition. In focusing our efforts on the furthest behind, it is important to measure nutrition outcomes and the ability to buy nutritious food. Many of the poorest people in the rural economy don't have assets such as land or livestock. Many will be casual workers, pretty much dependent on their physical health to earn a living. They need enough income to buy the nutritious food upon which their livelihoods and their health depends. In Rome, with my colleague Paul, Ireland has been championing nutrition through the WFP Friends of Nutrition group. Our term in the executive board coincides with a number of key nutrition initiatives. Nutrition has been proposed as the main theme for the Africa Union Summit in 2022. We're halfway through the Decade of Action on Nutrition 2016 to 2025, the Africa Regional Nutrition Strategy and the CADEP strategy, and also at an important stage in the EU's Farm to Fork strategy. And of course, the Nutrition for Growth Summit is taking place at the end of this year. The annual IFAD results report notes that nutrition outcomes are not an explicit part of its strategic programme objectives, and they're not yet effectively mainstreamed. This responds to an issue raised in IFAD's Nutrition and Agriculture Working Group on the increasing awareness of the need for nutrition-sensitive agricultural programmes, alongside relatively little evidence and experience on how to implement them. I'm pleased to see targets including that 60% of new investments should be designed to be nutrition-sensitive, and Ireland stands ready to work with IFAD on building its capacity in this area, sharing our own experience and networks. In summary, there's much to do, but also so much to build on. This is such an exciting year to be taking a seat on IFAD's executive board. Much of the hard yards have been covered in setting IFAD on the path to financial strength. Under President Ungbo's leadership, there has been a real strengthening of IFAD's institutional foundations and reforms that will make it fit for the coming decades. IFAD has always been and continues to be a source of innovation, dynamism, and solid partnership in the rural development arena. Now is the time to position IFAD with Ireland's firm support as a leading light in the area of food systems. The Irish government, and I think I can speak for the wider group of stakeholders reflected here in IFIAD, shares so much in common with IFAD. And I think now is the time for us to build on this and ensure that we can reach the furthest behind and bring about sustained rural transformation in some of the poorest contexts. And Ireland is committed to guaranteeing that the contribution of IFAD's 12th replenishment cycle is all that it can be. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Michelle. That's really wonderful. So I think next we will hand over to Leon, and it's really great to have Leon here from IFAD. And so Leon, I'll hand over to you. Okay.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Michelle. I'm just going to bring up the PowerPoint on my screen, so let me know if you can see it. Okay, coming now.
It's happening now, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Should be able to see it up on the screen now. So thanks, Chris, and thanks, Michelle, and thanks everyone else for connecting. And it's really great to have Tom Arnold here with us today as well. And it's fantastic to have an organization like IFIAD that can bring people together for events like this. You know, we've been enthusiastic supporters of IFIAD since it was first established a few years ago. And we really benefit a lot from being able to engage with you and also with similar platforms in other countries, like in Sweden, the SIANA, Swedish International Agriculture Initiative. And these are just great sort of entry points for us to be able to engage with a wide group of stakeholders with very similar interests to us in different member countries. For those, some of you I know, and it's great to see you again. For those that I haven't met yet, my name is Leon Williams, as you see on the screen. I was born and raised in a small village called Union Hall down in West Cork. I have some blow-in origins. You might have noticed from my accent, it doesn't sound pure Cork. But for the last 10 years or so, I've been based mostly in Rome, working with IFAD, initially on kind of program management work, especially on fisheries projects, which is my own personal background, coming from fishing community. And then in more kind of general project management roles, and somehow especially in the Horn of Africa region in countries like Eritrea, Somalia, Yemen, and various assignments in places like Jordan, Moldova, Tajikistan, and all over the place. But for the past few years, I've been responsible for IFAD's replenishment process, which is what Michelle was mentioning, and also as the focal point for IFAD's relationship with the Government of Ireland and our Irish partners, including organisations like Sustainable Food Systems Ireland that we're talking with, and many of you on the call here today as well. Just before I start, I also want to thank my colleague Charlotte Brumser, who's on the call as well today. Some of you also may know her. She was a student in UCD and joined IFAD as an intern. And she, I think, recently gave a presentation with you, Michelle, about disability from some work she had done with DOCUS. She's helped me out on a lot of different things, including the presentation today. And then before I start, just a final thanks to Michelle and her team in IFIAD, and Paul and the colleagues in the embassy here in Rome, and really the whole Government of Ireland for the amazing vote of confidence they gave us a few weeks ago when Ireland announced the increased funding for the next few years. And this is actually on the back of a previous generous increase of 25% to our 2019 to 2021 funding cycle. And I should also note that Ireland had quite an important role also in getting the Food System Summit off the ground. I know one of the first things that I worked with Paul Kiernan on when he joined us in Rome was to get a letter of support from Rory de Burke as Director General of IFIAD to the Secretary General of the UN to show Ireland's support for the Food System Summit initiative, which had been the concept was developed by the Rome-based agencies, by IFAD and FAO and WFP working together. But we wanted to demonstrate that there was also strong interest from some of the member states and members of the UN, and Ireland was very much ready to step up and give that voice of support. And we're looking forward to having you on the executive board. We know that you always bring a strong technical competence and an understanding of what we do on the ground, which is not always the case, but when it is, it's very helpful. So I'm going to give a quick presentation. Michelle's given some idea of the priorities for areas of engagement, and Charlie mentioned a few bits of background, but I'll start with a few introductory slides that give a bit more of an overview of what IFAD is, because we're not quite a household name like some other UN agencies, so I can't take for granted that people know what we do. And then I'll speak a little bit about the replenishment process that we've been going through for the past year and some of the new directions and challenges that are coming up. So, as mentioned, IFAD was founded in the 70s as a response really to the fuel crisis of the time and the famines and food crisis that followed it. And it was actually a partnership between the OPEC oil exporting countries and the OECD countries to make sure that some of these oil money that had come in the 70s was directed towards investments in agricultural projects in developing countries. And that still broadly underpins IFAD's governance today. We still have a system which is very much a partnership between the OECD countries, OPEC countries, and the developing member states, with quite an inclusive representation on our executive board and in all of our different governing bodies. And now we have a more or less global presence. We're working in about 93 different countries and have ongoing projects of around $17 billion, including about $7.5 billion from IFAD, and the rest from government partners and international financial institutions, private sector, and others. Just over half of that is in Africa. So that's the kind of main focus of our work, main focus of our field presence as well. But we do have projects in Asia, in the Middle East, Balkans, and even Latin America as well. But most of the funding goes to the least developed countries, and most of the beneficiaries that we serve are in the low-income countries and lower middle-income countries. And over the years, we've also had a fairly steady growth in our, we call our program of work, which is our total sort of investments that we manage and supervise. The blue line is the blue bar is our contributions from donors, which have been a little bit flat over recent cycles, but have taken a good jump up in IFAD 12. And despite that, we have been able to keep a steady increase in our loans and grants, particularly by borrowing funding ourselves that we then on-lend to other countries. This is something that's sort of unique to IFAD as a UN agency, that we're also a financial institution. And last year got our first credit rating. So we are able to borrow quite cheaply and on-lend to our member countries at rates much cheaper than what they could afford to borrow it themselves. And our investments focus a lot on things like agricultural productivity, rural infrastructure, financial services, rural enterprise development. But when we're doing these kind of investments, we're always looking with an eye to our thematic priorities on youth, gender, climate, and nutrition, and integrating these kind of concerns into our investments. Just to give a practical kind of example of what our projects might do, these are some numbers from a project in Ethiopia that just completed recently. It was an investment of about $60 million focused on small-scale irrigation. And so the project did everything from financing the irrigation schemes themselves to strengthening the water users associations to manage them, and training farmers and women's groups and others to make good use of the water once they got it, with the result that they had big increases in their crop yields when compared to the control groups. Now to come on to IFAD 12 a little bit, I just wanted to put it in context. Most of our projects are about 6 years long. So the projects that are approved between 2022 and 2024, which is the IFAD 12 programming period, are going to be implemented more or less over the next decade up to 2030. So it's really these projects that are going to be delivering the impact that we either achieve or don't achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I think we all know from the work of the different organizations that are here today that rural development, agricultural development, this is long-term investments. Things don't happen from one season to another, but you need gains and benefits to compound over time. And many of our projects, there's a long, like Charlie was saying, they're very much bottom-up kind of community-driven projects. So we invest a lot in capacity building, strengthening of community-based organizations, participatory kind of planning exercises before we even start kind of hard investments. So these things take time. And that's why IFAD 12 was really such a crucial kind of replenishment to get a bit of a boost in funding, looking over the next decade towards 2030, before we had the challenges of COVID-19 and the other crises layered on top of it. Then, as Michelle was saying, we have now an important development in IFAD 12 is really the broadening of the tools and instruments that we have available in each country, from our normal program of loans and grants, that's the POLG, so those are normal investments through governments typically, which can now be complemented with more climate finance from the ASAP project, with more private sector investment, and also linked up with our policy engagement with governments, with our knowledge work. So it comes together in an overall package that's really tailored to the country's needs, to their interests, and goes along with the government's own priorities that IFAD's often involved in supporting them in their national development planning to deliver that rural transformation that Michelle was referencing, what we're all aiming for, increasing incomes, increasing production, market access, and building resilience. And this slide, I was actually not sure whether to include it or not, but I thought to put it because it sums up a lot of the issues that will face Michelle and her colleagues when they come on the executive board. It's basically a lot of the discussions during our replenishment consultation. In that process, we have about 50 or 60 different member states representing every income group: donors, borrowers, fragile countries, low income, upper middle income. They have to sit down and agree. It's a multilateral institution and it's a multilateral process. So we have to agree on how IFAD's going to raise money, how we're going to allocate it, and how we're going to use it. One of the big kind of innovations of the current cycle is that all donor contributions, so all contributions, whether it's from Ireland or China, it's all going to be flowing to the low income and lower middle income countries, with most of it going to Africa. And all of our lending to upper middle income countries, where we still work mainly focused on kind of pockets of poverty and particular marginalized groups, that's all funded by our own borrowed resources. And then we're also mobilizing additional funds for the ASAP Climate Project program and for our private sector window, which we'll be developing over the next year or so with the help of the donors. But these are really the challenges that we're facing, and the kind of most difficult discussions that we have are around issues like graduation. When do we stop lending to a country, on what basis? And this comes back a little bit to IFAD's original founding, where our mandate was really to support all developing countries, but obviously with limited resources and different needs, we have to come to an agreement and find ways on how to manage that. And then once we've agreed on the allocations by country, the focus is much more on how do we do the right things in each country, how do we reach those most at risk of left behind, how do we prioritize which activities we're funding. And over IFAD 12, we will be updating our targeting policies, looking at how we engage in fragile situations, and particularly also countries that are affected by conflict, and how we stay engaged, and how we build resilience, on how we address the kind of rural and agriculture related drivers of fragility in some cases. And also really doubling down on those mainstreaming themes, the youth, gender, climate, and nutrition, and bringing in things like a stronger focus on biodiversity, and continuing to focus more on persons with disabilities and our relationship with Indigenous peoples groups, who IFAD has a very long history of working closely with. And of course, we don't do any of this alone. We work with a wide range of partners, from the RBAs, the Rome-based agencies, to the private sector, to civil society and other multilateral development banks, as well as the governments themselves. Work with them on policy coordination, on co-financing investments, and as implementing partners in different projects. And then finally, just to come back a moment to the replenishment, we have a target now of providing 3.8 billion in new loans and grants from our core funding. And we're aiming to reach at least 127 million people during the IFAD 12 period. And that's on a road to doubling our overall impact by 2030. We know from our impact assessments, the last ones we completed just a couple of years ago and we're updating now, that our projects around the world raise the incomes of 20 million people by every year. And we want to get that to 40 million people by 2030, while also deepening that impact and making sure that it's sustainable. And in IFAD 12, we took a slightly different approach to our sort of fundraising strategy. Most international financial institutions like African Development Bank or IDA have a very kind of traditional replenishment cycle. We all follow the same process. We have a series of meetings over 1 year with all our member states. We write a report at the end. We agree on a target. But we were inspired a little bit by the approach of some of the new vertical funds like Gavi and others, who take a bit more of a campaigning approach and do a little bit more communications and visibility and media and deliver good results. And we were lucky that Idris Elba and Sabrina Elba signed on or volunteered to be Goodwill ambassadors for IFAD last year. And they've been very busy over the past 12 to 18 months, despite the crisis, making lots of Zoom calls, having lots of meetings, talking to lots of heads of state. It's amazing the access you get when a celebrity comes calling. Everybody wants to talk, and sometimes they're not so enthusiastic on having a discussion about pastoralists or any other issues that we're normally working on. And of course, we had the good results last week when Minister Brophy joined our replenishment meeting to make the announcement of Ireland's contribution. And in fact, Ireland is becoming a kind of tradition now that Ireland is the first to make the announcement in each replenishment pledging session. It was the same in IFAD 11, and now we have Minister Brophy for IFAD 12, so we hope that continues long into the future. And that's the end, so thank you, and look forward to the questions and answers. And if you have any questions, I put my email address up there, so always feel free to get in touch. I put a few links. I guess I can share the PowerPoint with Patrice. She could share it with the participants if they're interested. And I look forward to the questions and answers. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Leon. That was a really wonderful overview of IFAD's work to date and IFAD 12 and an exciting kind of agenda ahead. So we're 14:36 now. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Tom Arnold for any reflections and comments Tom may have on Michelle and Leon's presentations. And then following Tom, we'll step into a questions and answer session towards the end at 3 o'clock. Okay, so over to you, Tom. Is that okay? Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Charlie. I'll try to keep things brief so that there's time for discussion. Firstly, I just want to say I'm a fan of both IFAD and IFIAD. I think it's very good that coming together here today. I think it's great that Ireland is assuming this role on the board, and even better that it's assuming it with a clearly thought out and coherent agenda that Michelle has outlined at the beginning. So I think this is all extremely positive. I'm not going to go over everything that Michelle said, obviously, but I want to pick out 3 points that I think are of particular relevance, in this particular special year of 2021. First one is Michelle's signaling that her second area, championing a food systems approach. I think we have to really realize that even though, as she said, this is the topic du jour, it's the flavor of the month in many international discussions, adopting a food systems approach is relatively new for countries, and it's not necessarily easy. It's new because in most of our countries, up to relatively recently, planning has been done on a sectoral approach. Ministries of Agriculture plan for the agricultural sector. And what the food systems approach is asking people to do is broaden that focus for planning. It's particularly requiring people to acknowledge that there is a link between policies for food, policies for the environment, and policies for health. That's what we are doing here in Ireland in trying to generate our own strategy, 2030 strategy for the next decade. But again, it has to be a little more a refinement of that, because you're not going to take all aspects of all of these three policies and try to link them together. There has to be quite clear and targeted selection of which areas produce synergies, which can realistically be asked to work together and bring benefits. The other thing that it requires is that planning is done on a more inclusive way, in a more inclusive stakeholder approach. And again, that's not necessarily an established tradition in many countries. So as we move towards accepting the fact that this is the way to go in terms of national and regional planning, countries are going to need help. And I think the combination of the experience of IFAD in its long tradition of stimulating engagement between government and different stakeholders at country level, and Ireland's similar tradition, that's a powerful combination to assist in moving this food systems agenda along at a practical level, because these things have to end up becoming practical in order to achieve anything. And that does mean, and Michelle mentioned this, looking at how a country's capacity can be built to both develop policy on the food systems basis and then implement policy. So this is, in this year of 2021, leading to the Food System Summit, this is hugely important. The second area you won't be surprised me to focus on is the second last area that Michelle spoke on, was nutrition. And here, by any standards, Ireland has a strong tradition to build on. Improving nutrition has been central to Irish development cooperation policy for a very long time. There will be an indication of that next week when Concern are hosting a conference to mark 20 years of CMAM, which was a major contribution to international development policy, particularly dealing for secure, severe and acute malnutrition. And I think anyone who wants to join that conference would be well served. But for today's conversation, what's important is that in terms of a better world, you know, just Ireland's new policy of 2 years ago, they're reconfirming the commitment to improved food and nutrition security, but putting it within the context of a sustainable food systems, which really is bringing up to date and, you know, what countries' needs are now. And I think this is extremely positive. And then when you look at the range of things that are going to happen over the next couple of years during Ireland's time on the IFAD board, the Food System Summit, you've got the WFP, its Friends of Nutrition approach, nutrition being the main theme for the AU Summit in 2022, nutrition for growth. Nutrition has to move back to the center of political and public and policy priority. There's a risk that it has slipped over the last number of years. It got into that position about 2010 and was there for a number of years. I felt it slipped over some recent years. Now it's coming back, and both Ireland and IFAD has a chance to make sure it comes back and again translates into higher priority at both national and international level. The final point I just want to make is about the Rome-based agencies. I've always admired how IFAD has managed to carve its own space, its own distinctiveness in what it does and how it presents itself. But I think it would not be unexpected. In fact, it should be expected that in a year where the whole focus on food systems is going to be much greater, that even greater clarity of purpose as between the different Rome-based agencies would emerge, and would emerge as a part of that process over the next period of years. And I think that could only be to IFAD's benefit. And I think part of the challenge facing the new board will be to make sure that greater clarity of purpose for the organization into the future is established. So Charlie, I'll leave it at that and hope that it can serve as the basis for some discussion.